All right, so get this. Today we are going on a deep dive into sugar dating. You guys have sent us a really interesting mix of sources. We've got news reports, documentaries, even some firsthand accounts, like straight from sugar daddies and sugar babies.
Wow.
It's really like getting a backstage pass to this whole world, isn't it?
Yeah. And it's interesting how much this has blown up in recent years. Like,
Yeah.
it's not this fringe thing anymore.
Yeah, mainstream.
Yeah, it's everywhere.
And that's why I think it's so important that we try to understand it, right? Let's go beyond just the surface level stereotypes. What is actually driving this trend?
Right.
Who are the people involved? And, what are all the complexities involved here?
Absolutely. I think people just assume it's money for sex, but these sources are painting a much more nuanced picture.
Right.
It's a lot more complicated.
Then, you mentioned money for sex. I immediately think of seeking arrangement, right?
Yeah.
They've really tried to rebrand this whole thing, right? As like a mutually beneficial arrangement. Both people are getting something out of it.
Right? Like Brandon Wade, the founder, he even argues that it can be empowering. Like, it's all about just being upfront about your desires and needs.
Yeah. But of course, not everyone buys into that.
Oh, absolutely not. And some of these sources like really push back against that hard.
Yeah.
One of the documentaries we have really dives into the stories of women who felt pressured to go beyond their comfort zones because they were financially dependent on these sugar daddies.
Even if there's some kind of initial agreement, things can get murky.
Oh, yeah.
Especially if there's such a power imbalance.
For sure. It's like a slippery slope.
Big power imbalance.
Yeah. And that's where the ethical debate comes in.
Yeah.
Is it even possible for a sugar dating relationship to be truly equal and consensual if one person's holding all the financial cards?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And I think it's not just an individual ethical dilemma either.
Yeah.
Some of the articles we have suggest that this whole trend might be a symptom of like larger societal issues.
Well, yeah, especially that article by Professor Fleming. It was so insightful. He talks about this idea of sugar daddy capitalism.
I love that term, right?
Sugar daddy capitalism.
He's arguing that this trend preys on economic desperation, especially among young women.
And it's hard to argue with that when you see how many sugar babies are, college students struggling with debt.
Exactly. And then the documentary we watched showed how, the pressure to achieve a certain lifestyle, fueled by social media and, what he calls filter culture, is driving some young people into these arrangements.
Oh, and speaking of social media, like, can we talk about how Instagram and these perfectly curated feeds play into this whole sugar baby fantasy?
Absolutely. It's all about this image of luxury and excitement.
Yeah.
But, what about the reality behind the filter?
Right. What about those nights when you're just not feeling it, but you have to like put on a smile because your rent depends on it? Or what about those sugar daddies who are more interested in controlling their sugar babies than having like a real connection? Exactly. Those are the situations where it's like, this is where the potential for exploitation and like the emotional toll, it can really come into play.
For sure. And it's not just limited to, certain types of people or specific locations. We've got sources that explore how sugar dating plays out in different cultures and even different like socioeconomic backgrounds.
It's true. The fact that this phenomenon is so widespread across like borders and demographics, tells us that there's something bigger at play here.
Okay, so we've got these big ethical questions, societal pressures, the whole filter culture element. But let's get into some real stories because these personal accounts you sent are so eye-opening.
Yeah, they really are. It's like we're not just talking about a concept anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Like we're seeing real people grappling with the choices and consequences of this lifestyle.
Let's start with Lila. Her story is like a chilling reminder of how dangerous this game can be.
Right?
I mean, she was abducted by a sugar daddy that she met online.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking. And it just reminds you that not every sugar daddy is like this charming, harmless gentleman. Like some have much darker motivations, and the power dynamics can be so easily abused.
And then there's Monica. She's kind of a more complicated character,
Yeah.
She admits to embellishing her financial situation to kind of gain an advantage.
That's like she's a character from a reality show, right?
Yeah.
Playing the game and using her wits to get what she wants.
But she even admits that there's a price to pay. She feels used, and she often goes along with things that she's not comfortable with just to keep the money coming.
And it goes back to the power dynamics. It's easy to talk about consent and agency in theory, but when you're financially dependent on someone, those lines can get really blurry.
For sure. Okay, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about some of the sugar daddies. We have a few accounts that are really revealing here.
Yeah, I mean, Bob's story, he's very upfront about his motivations.
Yeah, he does not sugarcoat it.
He does not.
He's a successful businessman, he's looking for companionship and intimacy with younger women, and he's willing to pay for it.
And he was very clear that sex is part of the equation for him. But he also really stressed that he values mutual respect and honesty in these arrangements.
So it's not purely transactional.
Right.
He actually wants some kind of connection, even if it's temporary.
Right. He seems to believe that both parties can benefit from this arrangement.
Yeah, but then you have someone like Nick, who has a very different perspective.
Oh, yeah.
Nick was the one who bragged about taking a group of young women to Coachella just to flaunt his wealth, and he even referred to them as decoration.
It's a pretty dehumanizing way to view these women.
Yeah.
He sees them as objects to be displayed and controlled, not as individuals with their own thoughts and feelings.
And that's such a stark contrast to Bob's perspective, and it just highlights, the spectrum of motivations and attitudes that you find within this community.
And it really emphasizes, that these relationships aren't monolithic. Like there's a whole range of experiences and perspectives within this world.
Okay, so we've talked about the darker side of sugar dating, the ethical concerns, the potential for exploitation. But what about the other side of the coin? Are there sugar babies and sugar daddies who genuinely find, happiness and fulfillment in these arrangements?
That's what we're going to be exploring next. We're going to be looking at those who say that sugar dating has empowered them, provided financial stability, and even led to, lasting relationships.
Yeah, it is interesting, right? You hear about the negative stuff a lot, but then you have these people who are like singing its praises.
Totally. Like Jennifer, her story really jumped out at me. She's a sugar baby who seems to be like living the dream, designer clothes, exotic vacations, even access to like credit cards.
And she talks about how she like set spending limits for her sugar daddies, which I thought was fascinating.
Oh, that's so interesting.
And it's like she's setting boundaries and taking control of this situation.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Like it shows that even within this dynamic, there is room for, negotiation and agency, for sure. And speaking of like taking control, there's Riley. She calls herself a professional sugar baby, and she really embraces this whole lifestyle.
She's not shy about asking for what she wants. Like she's gotten cars, designer bags, the whole 9 yards.
But here's the thing. She doesn't see it as manipulative. Like she views it as a game and she's winning.
Wow.
It's all about being smart and strategic.
It's like she's turned the tables on the whole power dynamic.
Exactly. And then you have her friend, Nicole, who has a totally different perspective.
Right.
Like she sees Riley's lifestyle, and she's obviously envious of the financial freedom, but she draws a hard line.
She'd rather work a traditional job, even if it means, struggling financially.
Yeah.
It's a matter of principle for her.
And that's what makes this whole conversation so compelling. There's no single right way to view this. It's all about personal values and what you're willing to compromise.
Okay, let's talk about the sugar daddies who say they're looking for something more than just, a transactional arrangement, because we have a few accounts that suggest, real connection is possible within this dynamic.
Yeah, like Joe, the businessman, he stood out to me. He was really open about his financial status. But he also said he wanted a partner who shared his interests and could connect with him on an intellectual level.
And his relationship with Sacha, while it was short-lived, it seemed to have those elements. They went to museums, they had like intellectual conversations. There seemed to be a real spark between them.
Yeah, it reminds you that even within this framework of financial support, genuine attraction and emotional connection can exist.
It's not always just about the money or the gifts.
Right.
But of course, even when there's that genuine connection, things can still get messy.
Absolutely. Like, look at Chris. He's successful, he's well-traveled, but he's lonely and he's unfulfilled. And he finds comfort in his relationship with Lena, a married sugar baby.
Wow. So his story really highlights that emotional vulnerability that can be at play for these sugar daddies. They might have all the money in the world, but they're still seeking connection and intimacy like everyone else.
And Lena's situation is complex, too. She's seeking financial stability and emotional support, but she's also navigating the boundaries of her marriage. Her husband is incarcerated, and she's essentially playing a double role.
It's such a delicate balance, and it raises questions about, loyalty, honesty, and just the emotional toll of living that kind of double life.
Yeah, it's a perfect example of how sugar dating can get tied up with all these other relationship dynamics and personal complexities.
It's not always as simple as it seems on the surface.
No, it's not.
Okay, so we've seen both the positive and negative sides of sugar dating, but I think we need to circle back to that big question.
Yeah.
The ethics of it all. We've heard Brandon Wade's perspective that it's all about honesty and transparency, But then you have critics like Professor Fleming who say this whole system is inherently exploitative.
He says it reinforces traditional gender roles and it preys on the economic vulnerability of young women.
Right. And let's be real, there's no denying that there's this power imbalance built into these relationships.
Yeah.
Even when you're talking about consenting adults, the question remains, is it really possible to have a balanced and ethical relationship when one person has all the financial power?
Yeah, that's where it gets really tricky.
Because even if you believe that adults should be free to make their own choices, there's no escaping the fact that this is all happening within a larger societal context.
A context where women are often valued for their youth and beauty, and men are judged by their financial success. So even if people are making these choices freely, are those choices really free from all those pressures and expectations?
Whoa, that's a big question.
It is.
I don't know if there's an easy answer.
And it brings us to another point, the potential consequences for society as a whole. Some people argue that this normalizes transactional relationships and it undermines the idea of love and commitment.
Like it creates this culture where everything's for sale.
Yeah, even intimacy and affection.
And then there's the concern that it just widens the gap between the haves and the have-nots.
Right. If young people are turning to this to make ends meet, what does that say about our economy and the opportunities that are available?
Yeah, it's like it's both a symptom and a contributor to this growing inequality.
It's complex.
Yeah.
There are no easy answers. And it really forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about our values, our desires, and how money and power shape our relationships.
Okay, so we've covered a lot: the glamour, the grit, the joy, the heartbreak, the empowerment, the exploitation. But I think there's one final piece of the puzzle we need to look at.
Yeah, I think you're right. We've talked about the individual stories, the ethical dilemmas, the big picture stuff. But what about the emotional impact? Like the long-term consequences for both the sugar babies and the sugar daddies? What happens when the sugar rush fades and they're left to deal with the emotional fallout?
It's funny. It seems like we keep coming back to this idea of, blurry lines and hidden costs.
Right.
We've heard from sugar babies who felt pressured into situations that they later regretted, and sugar daddies who, struggled with guilt or even like emptiness.
Yeah, it's like this emotional debt that kind of builds up alongside the financial exchange. And that's not something that's really talked about, in all the glamorous portrayals of sugar dating.
Right, exactly. Chelsea's story was really powerful, I thought. She was enjoying the material benefits like the trips and the gifts, but she admitted to feeling used and emotionally drained, like she was playing a part, and it really took a toll on her sense of self.
And I think that's something we see a lot in these personal accounts. It's that pressure to perform, to meet expectations, to keep the sugar daddy happy. It's got to be exhausting.
Oh, for sure. And it's not just the sugar babies, right? Like we heard from Chris, the sugar daddy, who felt this deep sense of loneliness, even though he was so successful and wealthy. Like his relationship with Lena provided some comfort, but it wasn't a real solution for his deeper emotional needs.
His story reminded me of something that the psychologist Sadia said. She was talking about how in a culture that's obsessed with external validation, we often end up seeking fulfillment in things that can't really provide it.
That's so true. And it's like sugar dating is this perfect example of that, right? People are trying to find happiness and connection through, possessions and these transactional relationships, but they end up feeling empty.
And the irony is that, searching for that validation from outside can actually make you more insecure and unhappy in the long run.
It's a vicious cycle, and it's not just about the individuals either. We can't ignore the impact this has on society as a whole. If we start thinking of love and intimacy as things you can buy and sell, what does that say about us?
Yeah, that's like we're blurring the lines between what's real and what's just for show.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder, in a world where everything has a price tag, can you even have real, genuine connection?
That's a really good question, and I don't know if we have the answer.
Me neither.
So after going through all of these sources, what are your final thoughts about sugar dating?
Well, I think it's complicated. It shows just how complex our world is. On one hand, you have people making their own choices, seeking financial stability or companionship on their terms.
Right.
But on the other hand, there are these ethical issues that we can't ignore. Exploitation power imbalances the possibility that we're losing sight of real human connection.
And it's not just black and white. There's so much variation in people's experiences and motivations. We've seen empowerment and exploitation, happiness and heartbreak, genuine connection, and, just shallow transactions.
Exactly. And that's what makes this so interesting. It forces us to confront our own beliefs about relationships,
Hmm.
money, what it really means to be happy in a world that's so focused on buying things and looking good.
So where do we go from here? What should people be thinking about after listening to all of this?
Well, I think the main takeaway is that whether you see sugar dating as something harmless or a sign that society is going downhill,
Yeah.
it's a conversation we need to have. We need to be talking openly and honestly about the ethics, the impact it has on society, the emotional toll it takes on people.
And maybe if we can understand these trends and what's driving them, we can start building a world where real connection and authentic relationships aren't overshadowed by money and superficiality.
That's a great goal to have.
Yeah.
It's about understanding that true fulfillment comes from within, from connecting with other people in a genuine way,
Yeah.
and from creating a world that values those things above all else.
Absolutely well said. And on that note, we'll leave you with this final thought to consider. In a world where the line between love and transactions is getting blurrier and blurrier, what does it actually mean to truly connect with another person? Some food for thought as we wrap up our deep dive into the world of sugar dating.